Welcome everyone to another Resource Teaching Tools. I'm Jeebs. I'm going to be talking about GM Pitfalls in Session 0. For some information about myself, I have been DMing for about a decade now. I've been playing tabletop RPGs for about 15 years or so. I have DM'd quite a bit of 5th edition, and I've done a decent amount of Pathfinder 2nd edition. I've done some Call of Cthulhu, some Shadowrun, and a few other interesting RPGs like that. So I'd like to say I've seen GM Pitfalls from both sides of the table, and I've also seen things that are important to have in Session 0 and a bunch of campaigns that never used it. So let's get into that. Let's talk about some of the ways that we can avoid common pitfalls. First of all, let's talk about the role of a GM. The 5th edition Player's Handbook for D&D, both in the 2014 and 2024 versions, describe the Dungeon Master as the game's lead storyteller and referee. The DM creates adventures for the player's characters, who navigates its hazards and decide which paths to explore. The DM tells the players where their adventures are and what's around them, presenting the basic scope of options that present themselves. Pathfinder 2nd edition describes the Game Master and player core as, while the other players create and control their characters, the GM, or Game Master, is in charge of the story and world. The GM describes all the situations that player characters experience in an adventure, considers how the actions of player characters affect the story, and interprets the rules along the way. Being the GM is a challenge, requiring you to adjudicate the rules, narrate the story, and juggle other responsibilities. A GM is a Game Master. That is a more generic term for any tabletop RPG. And a DM is a Dungeon Master, which is specifically for Dungeons and Dragons. So in this, I am talking about GMs in general. Sometimes I'll say DM because a lot of people, they interchange them. It's just normal. What is the role of a GM then? First, to present a story of the game in a clear and coherent way. Second, consider the actions of the players and how they interact with the game. Third, adjudicate the rulings for the game. And fourth, embody the world that the players do not directly control. What is the GM not supposed to do? They should not present an uninteresting, incoherent story without proper guidance for the players. They should not control the actions of the players or make decisions for them. They should not create unbalanced or unfair rulings for the players, and they should not get so lost in the details that it's impossible to get anything done. So let's go over some common pitfalls. First of all, ignoring the needs or desires of the players. Let's meet Winka Brex. Winka is a half-orc paladin. She is lawful good. She wants to prove to her family that she can be good despite her orcish heritage. She wants to make them proud. She's Oath of the Crown. That oath stands for law, loyalty, courage, and responsibility. It is the GM's job sometimes to try to figure out what a player wants to do with their characters. What is the player's intent? In this example, Winka wants to be someone who follows the law and is a shining beacon of good. Now, the GM's plan is to have the characters act as outlaws running for justice. There's nothing wrong with that plan. It's a fun campaign idea, and I'm planning to run something very similar with Theater of Dice myself. But without properly explaining the campaign idea, the player's goals will not align with the GM's goals. The GM needs to communicate clearly what their expectations are, or the players will struggle with their character ideas. I had this happen to me once as a player. My GM wrongfully jailed the party after a combat scenario. This is all part of the plan for them, but our characters were innocent. Specifically, my character, a lawful good paladin and a diplomat, was also innocent, and as such, she felt that she needed to prove her innocence legally in a court of law and work with the government rather than break out of jail and become a fugitive. In fact, doing so would have broken her oaths. However, the GM punished the choice. It would not allow diplomacy checks and ended up sentencing my character to exile, splitting her from the party and removing her from the game. The GM ignored the needs of the player and the character because they didn't fit the GM's intended narrative, but they failed to communicate that narrative beforehand to avoid this problem. So, how do we fix that problem? First of all, the GM needs to understand that the players are not your audience. The players are part of your story. They're writing it alongside you. If the GM has a goal for the tone of a story, it needs to be communicated before the story even begins. GMs need to work with the players as collaboration. Plan together, write together, and most importantly, have fun together. And of course, don't shut down your players' strengths. Let that barbarian grapple with his plus 12 athletics and advantage. Let that illusionist dazzle the enemies and shut down encounters with a single spell. That's what they're good at. So what are some common GM pitfalls? We talked about ignoring the needs or desires of the players. So, we need to communicate ahead of time what tone the game will have, especially if it clashes with character ideas. We need to work with the players to tell a story together, not just the story that the GM came up with. The next one, fighting against the party. Imagine the perfect boss. Here's the combat scenario. We have an ancient red dragon. The party is made up of a monk, a warlock, a barbarian, and a cleric. So, let's make our perfect boss resist what the party does. The monk likes to use its stunning fists, so it's pretty easy to add resistance to stun or even immunity to a red dragon. Maybe you want to encourage that warlock to stop using Eldritch Blast so much, especially because they got that invocation that knocks the enemy back 10 feet, and that's just really annoying. So let's make him resistant to that damage. And that barbarian, he is going to go reckless attack and do so much damage that the boss might die in 2 or 3 rounds, so let's give it a little more HP. Let's keep the barbarian busy for, 10 rounds or so. And we know ancient red dragons, they're supposed to be smart, right? So it's going to use smart targeting. It's going to target the cleric first and drain the cleric spells just on healing. And maybe we're going to give the red dragon some spells. Give it a debuff it can cast to counter the barbarian's rage resistance to fire. And perhaps, legendary resistance, that's a pretty common thing among bosses. Let's give him that, and ignore the warlock's best spells when it tries to stop casting Eldritch Blast so much. And dragons can fly. Let it fly out of the reach of the monk, and then swoop down to attack. And then the players start to get unhappy. They get disgruntled, and then they start to get KO'd, which makes them more unhappy. Where did we go wrong? It is easy to kill a party. This is something that GMs need to understand. It's very easy to just kill the party. It's difficult to provide a good, fun challenge. You want to enable your character's strengths. You still want to provide an adequate challenge, but never shut down a player completely. You want to treat your encounters like a puzzle to be solved. One good way to do this is to add multiple weaker enemies that act like the puzzle's mechanics to support the main threat. For example, you might have a wizard ally cast a wall of force around the boss. If you shut down the wizard ally, you disable that wall so you can finally target the boss. Multiple threats make it easier to balance encounters. Bosses won't be overpowered, and combat won't be shut down by a single banishment spell. Even though the GM controls all the enemies, it should never feel like the GM is actively against the party. The GM wants to tell an interesting story. Interesting stories have conflict, but interesting stories have triumph and success as well. When the players are having fun, everyone is winning. You want your party to succeed. You want to cheer on their successes and lament their woes. You want to help the players achieve their goals. So let's reimagine that perfect combat scenario. The enemies are now one big main boss and several easier minions. The main boss is more balanced for the party, so the cleric isn't almost dead after a single round, and the boss's HP is a little more appropriate. The warlock and the cleric can cast their powerful AoE abilities and destroy the mooks, while the barbarian and the monk gang up on the boss, or the monk can maybe stun one of the casters that's buffing the boss and feel rewarded for that. All of the characters are engaged, all the characters are playing for their strengths, and the players have to work together. They're going to have to watch the entire battlefield. The marshals might have to assist the casters if things go wrong, so they can't simply wail on the boss and smash. And finally, victory will feel earned and satisfying, both for the players and the DM. Alright, so fighting against the party? We want to balance the encounters to challenge your party, but not to shut them down. We want to rejoice in our players' successes. If they had fun, you're succeeding too. On to the third one, taking away player agency. Let's meet Oscar von Takibard III. The GM introduced an NPC to assist the party, as they were lacking in buffs and healing. Buffs and healing, a bard seems like a pretty good option. Of course, a bard needs really high charisma, which means they should be really talkative, right? Plus, it gives that GM a chance to practice their musical skills or their acting skills. So let's build Oscar to be the best bard possible. 20 in charisma, nothing wrong with that. Maybe expertise and persuasion. But you know what, party? Oscar's got plus 16, the next best person only has a plus 10, so maybe you should let Oscar handle these guards, okay? Now the party gets to watch the GM RP with himself for the next 20 minutes. What went wrong? Oscar is an example of a GM PC gone poorly. GM PCs have a bad reputation, but they can be used well in sparing amounts. I should probably talk about what is a GM PC. A GM PC is the Game Master's player character. A lot of people just think that this is always a bad GM PC. But a good GM PC can still be done. So let's talk about what a bad GM PC is like. If they are as important or more important than the rest of the party, if they make decisions or force decisions on the party, if they're as powerful or more powerful than the rest of the party, then they're probably a bad GM PC. A bad GM PC can take away player agency by putting choices back in the hands of the GM. A bad GM PC can make the effects of the players feel wasted. A bad GM PC takes the spotlight away from the players at important, critical moments. And a bad GM PC acts like a crutch for the GM to use to force a party in a certain direction instead of providing enough context clues through the environment or NPCs. There are other forms of limiting player agency as well. Railroading the players by forcing them down a single path, negating a player's choices, and shutting down creativity. Let's talk about each of those. Railroading. You've planned out a dungeon for your party, but they decided not to enter it, and instead they want to go to a different city. The work on that dungeon hasn't been wasted. It's just postponed. You can still use that work later on. You don't have to force them through the dungeon simply because it fits your story. Remember, this is a collaborative story. You're all working together. How about negating choices? If a player makes a choice, there should be consequences, either good or bad. The big bad end guy doesn't get to simply live because you miscalculated. You don't have to get rid of their banishment spell just because you forgot it was a charisma save instead of a wisdom save. Let the player's choices matter. Shutting down creativity. Have you ever heard them say, "No, this puzzle must be solved how I intended. You can't skip this room just by using a spell to trivialize it"? Sometimes the players are going to outsmart you. Let them. Reward them for it. Remember, you're not writing a story all by yourself. Instead, think of it more as writing a series of scenes that have a cohesive theme. In those scenes, your villains and heroes may die. Let the players decide how the story goes. As a GM, try to enable the choices of your players, within reason. More on that later. Any NPCs you add should be treated as a background character, secondary to the main cast of player characters. If an NPC joins the party and becomes a GM PC, they should not be taking decisions away from the players. A GM PC should not be more powerful than the players in combat. And yeah, even for those forever DMs, leave that cool build idea for a one-shot later on. They're not here for you to show off. So let's fix Oscar von Takibard III. If your party is lacking in some area, it's perfectly fine to give out a helper NPC and even have them join the party. When creating an in-party NPC, or a GMPC, that's what a GMPC is, consider what the class is best known for. If you duplicate another player's skills, make some changes, or downplay that part of the NPC's skills. Don't use the NPC as a chance to show off to the others in the group. This is their story, too. No one needs a show-off. The best combat NPCs are simple. For example, a life cleric is really helpful to heal and buff the party. A champion fighter is really great for frontline damage and defense. Limit your combat options so your NPC's turns are as short as the enemy's turns. Some simple spells like Cure Wounds, Bless, Divine Favor, and simple damage spells are easy fits. Add in some out-of-combat healing too. Let the party address the NPC before having them join in on decision-making, unless they're lost and need some guidance. But let the party decide whether or not to involve the NPC, and when to do so. So, taking away player agency? To fix that, we let the players make their own choices and reap the consequences, good or bad. We let the NPCs stay as background characters. The next one, inconsistent or too lenient rulings. Ever hear something like this at the table? I roll to seduce the dragon. Natural 20. You level up and gain extra attack and a +3 Vorpal sword. Or how about, that spell seems too strong. Let's make a concentration check to see if you can actually cast it or not. Or a new GM that says, I heard a GM should never say no. All of these deal with GM rulings. These can easily pass into the territory of inconsistent or too lenient. Every table is unique, and with care, some of these may actually work well, but before you start doing things that are difficult to work with, consider following the rules like they're written first. So let's talk about each of these. I roll to seduce a dragon. Sometimes, things are impossible, even if a natural 20 is rolled. An enemy intent on murder and destruction is not likely to emotionally do a 180 on a charm roll. In this case, it's sometimes best not to let your players roll at all, and if you do let them roll, it's okay to reward a very high roll without giving them everything. Perhaps it distracts the dragon enough to give them disadvantage on their next attack on that person. And I'm not saying they cheated, but sometimes it's better to require them to wait until the GM calls for a roll just to prevent these extra opportunities. Let's say the GM says you level up and gain extra attack and a +3 Vorpal sword. Please don't. Honestly, please don't. Level 5 is not the time for a legendary magic item. If you're not sure what kind of items to give your party, check the DMG. There's recommended levels for magic items there. If you're playing something like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there's a very handy item level on every single item. Overgearing your players results in an overpowered campaign. It doesn't make it more fun, it makes it harder to balance combat, and it forces enemies to be too powerful for the player's HP, or it turns those enemies into HP sponges. It makes combat boring and take forever. Instead, you want to let your characters have room to grow. You want to find more appropriate bonuses. This applies to things like homebrew changes or dice mechanics as well. That spell, it seems a little strong. How about you make a concentration check? If you're going to make sweeping balance changes, you need to be very careful. You want to be even more careful if you specifically weaken main class features like spellcasting, rage, or sneak attack. Inconsistently weakening your players feels bad for the players. Instead, you want your players to feel like a hero. I'll be the first to acknowledge that 5th edition D&D is not a perfectly balanced game. It's really hard to make anything balanced when there's this many features available. Sometimes homebrew can be helpful or even needed. You ever try crafting in 5th edition? But you need to discuss your homebrew with the party ahead of time, preferably before the campaign even begins. How about the GM should never say no thing? That's just flat out wrong. No is a very powerful tool in the GM's toolbox. You don't want to overuse it, but don't neglect it altogether either. Say no if something is impossible, unfair, or unfun. There are 4 really powerful options instead of just saying yes or no. You have yes and, yes but, no and no but. Let's talk about examples for each. The rogue wants to sneak attack a guard in a crowded street. He rolls stealth and got a 15. Does it succeed? So, yes and, you blend into the crowd perfectly, making your getaway. Yes, but you will need to hide the body quickly. Roll athletics to drag him into a dark corner. No, and the guard notices you before you get too close. You could probably distract him for your party member. No, but you notice the guard is leaving his post. Where is he going? What have I done here in each of these examples? I have answered their question on whether they succeeded or not, and then I provide something new for the player to act on. In the first one, he has a getaway that's clean. Now we're moving on to the next scene. In the second one, you have to do another check because you didn't quite get a perfect result. In no and, you were unsuccessful, but now you have an opportunity to do something to increase the chance of success for someone else. In the final example, no but, you were not able to do it because the opportunity didn't present itself, but something new is now happening. So, inconsistent or too lenient rulings. How to fix that? Focus on making the game more fair, more fun, and more consistent for all. Instead of shutting down your players, enhance their ideas with new options. Our next one, preparation woes. Welcome to my brand new homebrew world. I have 47 cities across 15 countries, each with a unique culture and rich history. It used to be 48 countries, except that Excamilion the Great from Carabas attacked King Farlander, Grandosh from BFA 1728. Stop. Take a break. Relax. It's okay. You do not need to plan every tiny detail. You only need enough detail for the players to have fun. And most of your players, they're not even going to remember or interact with half of that crap anyways. Over-preparing can lead to burnout, a lack of preparation where it actually matters. Your characters will still force you to act on your feet no matter how much planning you do. You can't plan for everything. So you got to get used to improv. It's an important tool. Or how about this one? Hey guys, thanks for coming to the game. I just woke up 5 minutes ago. Anyone remember what happened last session? Oh yeah, I was supposed to come up with a combat? Let me open the book and find a monster real quick. Underpreparing can be just as bad, often worse. Some players enjoy theater of the mind. I'm not talking about that. There's nothing wrong with theater of the mind. But sometimes if you improv too much, I don't know, it can be a little difficult. Players tend to respect and enjoy the effort you put in, to some extent. Having a plan in place will let you focus your improv where it really matters, improving the players' fun and enjoyment. Alright, preparation woes. You want to avoid under or over preparing, and you want to practice improv, but with some guidelines. So, we've talked a lot about some common GM pitfalls. One of the best ways to avoid some of these pitfalls I had talked about was to mention some of these things and communicate before you start your campaign. And the best way to do that is with a session zero. So why is session zero? A lot of these issues can be fixed or mitigated. What is a session zero? It's a session before the campaign even starts. In a session zero, you discuss important things like homebrew, the tone of your adventure, expectations for the game, and player or character introductions. If your table is newly formed, you might want to introduce yourself as the GM and what players can expect from you. A session zero can be used to set a baseline for communication. It can show an example of good open communication, which is important for any relationship, whether it's a friendship or a GM-player relationship. And it also includes communicating about whether things are uncomfortable for a player. One common option to do this is to give people the opportunity to put up a red card. And a red card can be a literal physical thing at your table, or it can just be a message sent to the DM's private messages. Session zero can set rules, restrictions, custom rules, and behavioral expectations. Theater of Dice already has a lot of these rules in place, but it's always good to reiterate them. A session zero can help finalize some character interactions, backstory specifics, or rules questions as well. Some specific topics for session zero: player behavior. This includes things like waiting for the GM to request a dice roll, like we talked about earlier. Player versus player interactions, like infighting. The rules of your game, the rules of Theater of Dice. Game rule disputes, meta knowledge, sharing the spotlight with everybody, things like murder hobo activity, and the behavior at the game. It's like using cell phones or cross-talking over each other and showing respect for others. And how about expectations for the GM? This includes things like the GM's style, some pet peeves you might happen to have, some homebrew rules that you plan to use, how you're planning to provide levels or XP. Are you using normal experience or are you using milestone, for example? How you're planning to do DM inspiration or hero points, and anything that's not standard about your game. You may want to discuss specific game expectations, like the chances of dying, how to handle player absences, or how you prefer to handle feedback, both positive and negative. Again, keep that communication open. You want to talk about any content concerns. This includes things like content that's not allowed in the game, using correct pronouns for players and characters, providing an opportunity for players to say that something is uncomfortable, both before the campaign begins and privately during a session. If you know your campaign is going to cover content that can be disturbing to some people, make sure they know about it ahead of time. And we can also clarify rules questions. This includes asking the players if anything is confusing, going over rules you find are often misunderstood, such as using multiple spells in a round, or readying actions, or stacking advantage, etc., and talking about rule options you'd like to highlight, like crafting. Topics to avoid for Session 0. Session 0 usually is not the place to create the character. You want to provide character creation rules before Session 0. It might be best to require characters to actually be fully finished before you even get to Session 0. This allows you to introduce the characters, to go over sticky points like inventory or mechanical questions. You can also use the time to weave backgrounds together and create party investment in your story. Some GMs actually prefer to do character creation during Session 0, so your mileage might vary. If you do decide to do this, consider to have a second Session 0 after to discuss all the things we just talked about. A Session 0 is not the place to teach the game brand new. Do this before Session 0 if you have newer players. Now, explaining difficult specific rules and answering questions is perfectly fine. And if all or the majority of your players are brand new, it might even be good to have a mock combat to test out character builds, or to teach them how to fight in the game, since they're probably going to do that a lot. So let's recap. DM pitfalls: ignoring the needs or desires of the players, fighting against the party, taking away player agency, inconsistent or too lenient rulings, and preparation woes. And for Session 0, we want to talk about player behavior, GM expectations, content concerns, clarifying rules, and we want to avoid character creation and avoid teaching the game brand new. All right, on this previous slide, is there anything that you'd like to go over in more depth or anything?
No, it pretty much covered a lot of what GMs go through, especially if they're new and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was really good and really well done. It's really succinct, and it really gives a broad view of some of the stuff to avoid and how to do better as a GM as well.
Thank you. Do you have any examples yourself of either as a DM or as a player coming up against any of these things?
Kind of with the saying no bit, I sometimes just I kind of let them have complete reign, and if they want to come up with an idea, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with them, but then also have that conversation as well. All right, how do we balance it so it's not overpowered and taking away from others?
Right.
I remember the first game I ever went to go play, there's two DMs. They said, all right, send us your character background. Then they completely rewrote my character's background, changing everything that I wanted to make my player unique. And then they said to me, all right, you arrive on the island. How would you do that? I said, well, something I would see is my character does not really know that he's lost a lot of his strength. So he's going to try and pick a fight against these bad guys. And then, he gets knocked out and he ends up washing on shore. And then turns out, oh, no, that's not possible because he'd just get killed. I'm like, what the? And then their response to me was, we don't think you're the right fit for this campaign. Maybe you should go back and do one-shots only.
Oh, goodness.
I'd only just started playing Dungeons & Dragons. And I was kind of like, maybe I shouldn't be playing this shit.
Right? But to recap, what they did there was they took the character you created and they completely rewrote it. They took away your player agency. And when they tried to have you make a choice, they negated that choice by saying, no, you can't do that, and here's why. Instead of saying, you know what, that sounds really cool, let's work with that. You pick a fight, you get knocked down, you're going to wake up bloody the next morning, maybe some cleric takes pity on you. There's a whole host of things that they could have done to work with your story, but they decided instead to just shut down your ideas. And then they insulted you and told you to go back to the drawing boards. Yeah,
because my original plan for this character was that he was a chromatic red dragon, he was evil, but then he had a realization that that wasn't the right path. ran away from home. His dad sent elite warriors after to kill him. He confronted one of them. They beat the living daylights out of him. That's how he washed up on shore.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, no, because they just kill him and take him back to his dad. Maybe they were banged up from the fight. Who knows?
Yeah, there's plenty of ways to make that work. One of the things I like to do, and it's not never say no, but I like to enable my players' choices. Sometimes you do have to say no, like I've said, but you want to say no and provide them an opportunity to expand on it. So, for example, in your case, if their entire worldview is that this person you're running away from is super strong, their army is super strong, so no, you wouldn't be able to run away from them like that. Instead, they could say, maybe you were locked up in prison and you found some way to escape from the prison, you've actually put in the effort of breaking out of prison, and now you're fearful for your freedom and maybe your life. And yes, they are super powerful. They are going to beat you down, but now you're on the run. So maybe you hop a ship and you shipwreck, and that's how you arrive on the island. That's working with the story idea that you had instead of just completely shutting it down. But better yet, I would say, is, your idea is great. Let's go with it. There's nothing rules breaking about it. There's nothing lore breaking about beating up some guards. Everything seems to work out fine to me. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you said about running a campaign, I'm like, oh, I hope I'd be able to jump in on that one.
The Outlaw campaign?
Yeah. So when are you planning on running that?
We're actually starting on Monday. In fact, by the time this video goes up, we'll probably have already done our session 0. But we are playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition with that, and we're doing Outlaws of Alkenstar.
Nice. Sounds fun.
Well, thank you for coming to my DM talk, for sitting
My
through
pleasure.
it. I appreciate it. And
it's my pleasure.
we got to add some more fun stuff at the end too. So,
which is always a good thing.